Welcome to the Legal Growth Table. I'm Andrew Hutchinson.
And I am Barbara Koenen-Geering.
And together, we are your hosts. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with the people who are actually doing the work of growing law firms from the inside. The ones who know where the real conversations happen, and more importantly, where they don't.
Because everyone in this industry talks about growth. Very few talk honestly about how it actually happens. The politics, the resistance, the things that didn't go to plan. That's what this table is for. So let's get into it.
Mike, good morning. It is a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How are you doing in cold New York this morning?
Doing great. Staying nice and toasty here. We got about a foot on the ground. But thanks so much for having me. I always look forward to the opportunity to talk with you and Barbara. So thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us. I mean, so much to talk about. 26 has really kicked off with a bang, I think, whether that be from, the work that firms are getting, AI, what does growth mean to law firms? How do we, market and BD in the future of there's so much that we can talk about. But maybe we could start with a bit of your background. And I know, some of the people listening to this will know some of your background, but I think your journey is really interesting, how you got into legal, the things that you learned along the way. And I think that there's so much foundation in there for what we can talk about. So maybe we could start there.
Great. Yeah. Did not, like many of us in the legal marketing landscape, did not, aspire to this when I was 8. Didn't really know it existed. I think I wanted to be an astronaut or something. But, it fell into professional services marketing, basically out of college, writing RFPs in financial services. And, I've tried throughout my career to kind of swim a little bit more upstream and really understand what are the various factors that kind of get us to that end game. But during the journey, it took me to different custody banks and asset managers. But a very formative time was working at the Big Four at KPMG on a big deal team. Basically seeing that there was an auditor and advisory opportunity to play in 4 or 6 months, and kind of basically flying into that particular region or office, and really serving as that sort of center hub. Who's aggregating all the information from site visits, who's developing the messaging, and what are we doing? How are we moving these different chess pieces around? And I love that. No one on the outside knew I existed, and on the inside, a lot of that strategy to kind of put people in who's transitioning next, and a lot of orals preparation, things like that. And when I moved to legal, I was under the impression that it was sort of that was there. And, they hired me and another gentleman from Deloitte to co-head the proposals team over at Paul Weiss. And, that was interesting to kind of, come in and see, hey, you know what? There's not a lot of this preparation. A lot of people are sort of winging it. Are they given all of this information? No, they've really kind of learned it from this apprenticeship method. And that's kind of what they've known in the past. And so, like both of you, kind of coming in with your eyes wide open and learning and, seeing the opportunities to systematize, and really sort of formalize that process and bring best practices around and cascade them around to organizations, is really where, there's a ton of opportunity. And we're seeing some of these firms do it really well, bringing in, specific salespeople and others who don't. And so, in the last year and a half, built my consulting business really on that basic blocking and tackling, and being able to put processes together that, frankly, are not only going to help your win rates, but are saving you money on the front end, just in terms of realization, in terms of turnover. Just with staff saying, what, we've done this 9,000 times. Why are we doing this at the same time? And partners, sending around pardon the interruption emails and all that great stuff you guys know and love. But yeah, building systems is really, where I see a ton of opportunity, and getting folks to align with those systems. We see those Myers-Briggs, personality tests with, lawyers not, loving autonomy. But, there's got to be a happy balance there to where, we're all speaking the same language and working from the same playbook, and that's been my job security. So it's been enjoyable over the last 2 years.
You said that last piece about speaking the same language, and we were talking about this in our little prep beforehand. But this is something that, Big Four seems to have down pat, right? They have that structure. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in a Big Four accounting firm.
Sure. Well, first of all, it starts with investment, and it starts uh, with training. It also starts with, not having such a flat structure, and you come from the Big Four, the head of M&A, they tell you to jump, you say how high. And,
Hmm.
that's everything really kind of dialed through there. I think there's definitely a pecking order. I think that in law firms, I think leadership, by itself is a unique concept. Is the head of M&A really the best leader, or are they the person who is the most famous? And they're kind of getting this as a trophy without really understanding or caring about what the responsibilities might be. How are you taking that person to the next level? How are you taking that female associate and giving her opportunities? Are they thinking in this way of really trying to build the next operation, or are they saying, hey, I'm the head of M&A, and
It's a
that means I
privilege
get
rather than a job. Yeah,
yeah, the inbound call.
yeah.
And so, I think it really starts with that, with, kind of that accountability. And I think from that accountability, it's a lot easier to build structure.
I really like that because also the systems part that you mentioned, I think the starting point, I mean, we hear these growth, discussions everywhere, right? Partners saying that they want to achieve certain levels of growth, and the theme seems to be growth across all the different firms that we're speaking with. And for all of these firms, growth means something different. We get that. But I think the whole starting point is sometimes forgotten. So they want to jump to a point, their North Star or whatever it might be, but then there is no foundation really that they're building off on. So very basic things like the things that you've mentioned as well, like the structure, the system, looking at your people and processes is so fundamental. But how come it's still sort of like a thing that is overlooked? And when you look under the bonnet, I mean, I've done that many times. I'm in shock with sort of like the state, if not only data, but it's also processes and identifying where growth could actually happen. Then only determine what growth should really look like. Because if you don't know what sort of like, yeah, the foundation for you, how does it work?
That's exactly it, and then the compensation models. You could do everything right, and if you're not incentivizing the behaviors you want to see, well, you're back at square one, and you find unintended consequence everywhere. Where oh, if you originate X to this, you'll be in this band. Well, you know what? What are people doing on December 30th? They're waiting until January 1st to have this bill hit because they know that they're not going to hit this band. And everything you do, there's going to be this kind of unintended consequence. But people aren't, to your point, Barbara, kind of taking that step back and saying, all right, what does this look like now? What is our North Star? What is it? And what are the processes we need to get there? And really kind of doing that, I think sort of simple mapping. And when you're forcing people to do things, the competition is tight and people are moving to different places where they don't have to do it. People would start getting the time to kind of take a breath and really think strategically.
It's interesting you talk about the North Star. We were talking about this with a leader from a large Indian firm earlier last week, and we were talking about the importance of culture and North Star together, because we keep talking about the fact that the compensation model's broken. We don't drive collaboration in our firms because we incentivize them to continue to be these siloed individuals. And so, everyone talks about this idea that we should change the compensation model. You can't change the compensation model, in my opinion, unless you can get all the partners to come together around the idea that they want to do something different, right? We want to be X firm, or we want this culture, or we want to grow by in this direction. If you can't bring everybody together, how can you possibly hope to change the compensation model, right?
Yep. Yeah, and then people who are going to benefit. Typically it's the people who are benefiting from the current structure who are the
Mhm.
people who are making that decision, right? And so A bunch of folks want a team. Well, that one rainmaker who doesn't like to follow rules, who doesn't want to use a CRM, who, is also the one making 14 million and has, 4 points and has, votes in the EC. Well, it's difficult, again, if you're not showing them what's in it for me, to get them to, try to, kind of change towards the common good. And the competitive set is out there where, as we were talking about before, if, this person doesn't want to get in line, I'm sure there's some law firm that's going to say, hey, you can do it however you want. We'll bring you extra people and you can be your little snowflake over here. And, until that model changes, I think we're getting there with some of this consolidation, but, until people have an option, where they're, hey, I can go out here and make more money and do it my way. There's going to be a lot of this musical chairs we've seen for years.
Well, I think that's interesting, right? I was at an AI event at the back end of last year, and they were talking about the power of AI to give partners yet another alternative, right? And we think about the kind of lateral moves in large law, to your point, to try and find a better place, right, where I don't have to do all of the stuff that I don't want to do at this firm. And they were talking about this idea that AI is now empowering collections of very senior lawyers to step out, set up their own boutique firms, because they can build all the infrastructure in theory that they would have at a large firm by using technology, by having the technology support the things that they do. And so, it's really interesting, right, as you think about an industry that's desperately trying to hold on to the old way of doing things to a certain extent. But actually, what is the future going to look like? I remember when I first started selling CRM in 2015, and I'd walk into a law firm and say, you should buy a CRM system. Yeah, but we made 10% more than we did last year, and that was 7% more than the year before, and 15% than the year before. And I remember sitting there thinking, what on earth have I done? Why am I trying to sell a system to people that just keep making money? Like this doesn't make any sense. But what's interesting is I think now, whilst that continues to be the case, and obviously there's a lot of debate around, will AI change billings and will we see a decline in revenue in law firms? Let's be honest, law firms aren't going to let themselves disappear. So I think that will continue. But I think what we do see, and I'd love to get your perspective on this, I think we're seeing more sophisticated buyers on the client side. I think you're seeing more of procurement come in. Yes, there's still a heavy relationship piece, but I think that they are looking for more. They're taking law firms through more hoops to get to a decision. And that's a different skill set, right? To be able to manage that sort of engagement.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. The expectations have changed. Wow, I'm really good at this is such table stakes, right? Being able to contextualize that information into actionable things, not just telling people what they can and can't do. Here's what the guardrails are, but find me the yes, right? And the folks who are really knowledgeable, not just about industry, but about their own internal capabilities. It's shocking to come in. You provide all this access. You might have an intranet that's got everything. You're doing these newsletters. You're highlighting different folks in the hey, here's a cross collaboration opportunity. Here, we've gone down and we've seen a best practice kind of case study. Let's try to replicate and scale this somewhere. Folks just don't have time until we can kind of build those avenues of communication and collaboration. And I took that upon myself, really, to if this isn't working this way, we've got to create another way. Is it in person? Is it this? We've got to improve this knowledge to where people are, those light bulbs are going off when they're having client conversations. And
Yeah.
we've got to set that up somehow.
Isn't it sort of like where we're going to? I think we talk a lot about, developing sales engineers, for example, within the media marketing function, right? To help map these processes out and make sure that we're all aligned on who knows who and what is the intel that we already have on matters, on clients, on general data, for the partners then to be able to actually go speak with the client or with the prospect in a more informed manner. I know this is happening at some law firms to some extent already, but I think personally this is going to take next level. But especially knowing sort of like where AI is going to take the legal delivery side of things, we have to keep in mind that law firm clients also have access to the same tools. So it's no longer, I mean, even tools like Legora and Harvey, they are selling into in-house counsel, right? So they will be as sophisticated. The only thing that is sort of like a variance there is that law firms, and we talked about this a lot, they, I think, get more of this positioning where they provide that, you know, risk insurance, the security seal. It's like if they sign off on it, then, you know, like the McKinsey effect, essentially. If they sign off on it, then it must be good and I cannot get fired. Like we are going to make the right decision, or at least we have, you know, 99% of the information that we need to be able to make that decision most accurately. But I think the BD and marketing function is also going to play more of a role in its engineering piece. I'm not sure if you've seen this already across firms where they've been very much at the front of this, or whether you see this developing, or whether it's just an untested theory from me and Andrew. Could be.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see it. You know, sales was a dirty word. I think it's finally not becoming a dirty word. You know, people realizing, hey, you know what, this is a real craft. It's a real skill, and you know, it's taught. It's, you know, it's learned. It's not just solely through apprenticeship, but you know, you bring in experts. You know, Hans Haglund was, you know, one of the first, and you know, Steve Bell and these guys who are coming in and actually, you know, really bringing that value and connecting those dots. And you know, fortunately at Prior, you know, I sort of weasel myself into, you know, be able to come along to, you know, whether that was coming with a corporate partner, coming with a patent partner, and just kind of being that, I don't want to say encyclopedia, but, you know, listening for those signals and saying, hey, you know what, hold on here. You talk about, you know, before we form this company, you know, wanting to, you know, develop a patent. Does it make sense for us to bring in X person, and, you know, really just kind of mapping that and still letting that, you know, the partner kind of, you know, maintain that relationship, but really being somebody who could bring in those appropriate resources and kind of thread that stuff through. You know, proof is in the pudding, right? When you're able to do that and you'll get that trust of one partner, you know, I think it does get those things going. But that enablement function is something that's kind of that missing level, I think, that, you know, we talk about. And you know, a big onus of what, you know, Barbara, you and Andrew are trying to do here in kind of this next iteration is, you know, kind of build these structures and bring this knowledge to people. So I think we're all kind of, at least the three of us, speaking from the same playbook.
Well, it's so interesting, right? Because, you know, I've been a professional salesperson all my life, which was a total accident, by the way, and much to my parents' chagrin. I remember for the longest time, my parents, you know, people would ask my parents, "Oh, so, you know, what's Andrew doing?" Oh, he's in technology, right? Because even, you know, even in their circles, sales was a dirty. Well, your son's a salesman. Well, he obviously didn't do very well at university. Well, he didn't. Why he's there, but that's a different story, right? But you know, sales is one of those things. Sales, just in general terms, has increasingly become a profession in itself, right? Um, and I think sometimes people don't realize that actually, even in the sales community, there are some people who are really, really good at what you've described, Mike, which is that enablement piece, being able to identify the opportunities, how to navigate a conversation, how to navigate a process, how to ensure that the person you're presenting to has a really good perspective on what makes you different, why are you unique. Now, in legal terms, it's not just the fact that you're ex-litigator and, you know, you've done this many things, right? There's probably someone else like you, or maybe a small collection of people like you. And so how do you differentiate beyond that? And it is um, it's a really tough skill. And, you know, I meet salespeople all the time who don't have that skill. But often what we see in law firms is you're expecting that from your partners, people who aren't full-time salespeople, who trained to become lawyers. And you talk about that sales enablement gap. I think that's huge, and I think there's a huge opportunity in there, as we start to see sort of continued development, I guess, in how clients buy.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it starts, it's baby steps, right? And we talked a little bit leading up to this, just around getting people speaking the same language, getting people to just be wise about what their partners do. I think so many times it's what's in my brain, what your partner did next door is part of your differentiation strategy. The fact that you guys go to coffee and you hang out with a labor and employment, there's value in that. And so yeah, I totally agree there.
And it's systems, I think, as you said earlier, right? It's about having the right systems in place to support that level of thinking. So if you don't have you said earlier, you've created really interesting systems around, for example, experience management. It's really important, but it's something that is often, forgotten or doesn't take priority because it's such a heavy admin type of thing to do. But if you don't have those systems, you also can't be in that place where you are able to connect the dots and where you can make those connections. And when we did some of these interviews with managing partners as part of our Boost platform, where we reached out to partners and we spoke about what they actually need from a business development and marketing function, the number one thing they said was the appreciation for people to be able to connect the dots, because it's something that they can't really do because they are so stuck with their own practice. And even if you're a managing partner, I mean, most managing partners in law firms, they still have a billable target somehow. And if they don't have a billable target, they will make their own billable target because it's important to stay connected to the practice, which is understandable. But at the same time, it prevents you from keeping overview of everything, right? And I think that's where the real value lies, is that a helicopter overview where you can see which practice area is doing what type of work with others and where they collaborate and where not, and where the white space is essentially. But you can only do that if you have the systems in place. And I'm not talking about tech systems, I'm talking about systems of record, those that you've also created, which is then clearly fundamental.
Well, the attorneys have, identified, a metric, and it's, the value you bring is, simply tied to this billable, but it's a short-sighted view to not have, these people somehow compensated, somehow measured in a different manner, right? Is it an overall, is it a 3-year growth pattern? Is it, whatever that is, to essentially showcase value. Hey, people bring value beyond what they're doing this month in billing a client, right? But let's look at cross-selling opportunities. How those changed. So I totally agree with you. The other thing is simple things like attorneys talk in features, and clients care about benefits, and that's a simple math. Where, okay, what is the fact that you've done 20 M&A deals just like this? What does that mean for them? They don't care that you did 20 M&A deals. What they care is that, you've done 4 in the cosmetic space, and you understand that here's the antitrust issue that's going to arise in France when you do this. And so as a result, we've already developed a 2-page checklist. And now you arrive to the checklist, that's that thinking that it's a way of thinking that, you got to turn people on to, and people are busy, and you got to start small. I'm sure we'll get into it, but it's for me, it's all about pilots, and get 1 or 2 people and get them talking around a water cooler, and all of a sudden I get tapped on the shoulder and someone says, "What are you doing with Jimmy there? I heard that you went on a road show with him." And and maybe you tell a couple people strategically, it's going to get somewhere. But yeah, it's all about that system and the scalability. Otherwise, you're continuing to reinvent the wheel, and realization rates stink, and people get frustrated, and you're losing money.
It's a good. I mean, there's a good lead in there, Mike. You've both sat in seat. You've both tried to figure out how do you start to make this change. In different contexts, different types of firms. Like, to people who are listening, who are sitting there thinking, well, yeah, I kind of buy into what you're selling here. how do you get started? Like, and you talked a little bit there, but like, what are the things that people can do to really start changing the way that the firm thinks? How do you start building a process, to your point, Barbara? And just, take one step at a time.
Well, I
Yeah,
can tell
and
you I've tried the Dutch direct approach. I'm telling you, it doesn't work, especially not in law firms. So I'll let Mike go first, so everyone can learn from my mistakes. But Mike, there you go.
well, um, yeah, I think. I'm sorry. Where? What was the question again? I apologize.
How do you get started? Like, how do you,
Oh yeah.
ha-
Yep.
if you're
Yeah.
somebody that's listening to this going, this is great, but like, I don't even know how to take the next step from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think knowledge is power, right? That's the
Mm.
one thing we know. And the first thing you got to do is you got to get a sense of what's going on in your organization. In many cases, systems are broken. There might be multiple versions of that system. I think you got to just, one bite at a time. I came in, it was, broken CRMs, and maybe experience management systems are non-existent. Until you can kind of get some language and get some data and get some proof points that show you belong in that room. It's really difficult to kind of come in and willy nilly sort of start trying to impose change. I had a great failure story. Where you were saying these approaches don't work. I came in and said, oh, I see what the problem is. And I sent around this, we're going to do this firm-wide policy, and it was like, you could hear the laughter coming down. It's month one. You gotta understand the people and the players, but then you've got to build different systems to where you're pointing out your data. So, when I started, at one firm, it was no experience management, so they didn't really know. Everyone's kind of running around sending these different. I started building different systems to where I could sort of pull out information and begin to bring value. And so, going and sitting down with a practice group chair and saying, listen, we work with all these different types of firms, and kind of how do you know that? Well, I've poured down into this data. Here's what I've pulled out. Is this right? Is this wrong? Well, actually, we don't track this right. Okay, well, you got to kind of figure that stuff out before you can start making any sort of hypotheses. And so fixing those processes and being able to bring information to people, and then point out strategically where they're saying, oh, well, I've seen it work this way and I've done this. Yeah, well, actually, that's funny. You've seen that work that way, but according to our data, unless this is wrong,
It doesn't.
here's X, Y, and Z. And
Yeah.
that kind of gives them, well, what else is there? But you've got to have kind of a hat to hang on, and you can't just kind of be coming in and saying, here's what I see, because the lawyers are going to say, well, I've done this for 30 years and you don't know what you're talking about, even though you come from a different industry, or the same industry, and you've seen it done better. Until you get those data points, it's difficult to work. Second thing I'll say is really that, not to beat the dead horse, but it is the coalitions of the willing, coming
Yeah.
in. You're not going to tell that 10 million person right away, and but in good news, they probably don't need your help as much as the $2 million person who, had $4 million at one point, or, last year had 500,000. Okay, this person is hungry. They've shown the ability that they can do this. And so working with someone like that who really wants your help, they want to bring you along on a trip. They want to bring you to a conference. And I used to take that opportunity very seriously. Okay, well, what can I do to really push this bar? If I can bring in, one or two clients on this trip, that word is going to get around. And so, being able to do that, and in some cases that's your second job, right? And you're doing it, and it's almost they're giving it to you almost as a reward, where you still got your day job to do, and you're doing this at night. But if you're into that stuff, you're taking advantage of those opportunities. The word gets around in different ways, and you're increasing your value, and all of a sudden you got more people coming, and you got to build a system there so that you can resource up, right? And whether you're tracking queries, whether you're tracking reach outs, tracking a number of engaged partners, but figure out what success looks like, and make sure you build those systems so you can kind of have a before and an after. and you can point and just not say, hey, you know what, I'm super busy now. I got more partners coming to me. But hey, I used to get, 5 queries from these partners a month. Now I have 27 partner queries a month. Now I have, 4 different capability decks, and, you're starting to just put some rigor around that. It gives you a lot more cachet when you're in those difficulty C meetings. You just got to be armed with data, and
Data,
anticipate.
yeah. I wanted to say that. Data is everything.
Yeah, they fight for a
Right.
living, right? So you're already kind of tied with one hand behind your back, so you better be prepped. But yeah, building those systems in many cases, firms don't have it. They run from the gut, they run from their experience, and that's probably the biggest hurdle that we have is systematizing this involves data, and then you can point to stuff, and if those systems are wrong, and maybe they're not inputting their information, but you're going to find out, and you slowly start building them.
It is the chicken and the egg, isn't it? Right? It's like you need and I say this to people all the time, right? The beauty of starting on a data project, if you do it right, is that you can incrementally start showing value, right? And you can show the power of the data to answer questions and to challenge the things that you want to challenge the partners on. Because as you both know, having lived and died in law firms, right, they're all about the detail. And so if you can justify with data and say, well, look, this is what the data is telling us, you can
They
start
would
to move.
still argue with that, at least attempt to, I'm telling you.
Well,
But it's a
well,
great starting point. Yeah.
well, and that is, I mean, we joke about, relationship scores as an example, right? With two partners, arguing the toss over, well, why have they got 7.5 when I've got 6.4, right? And so, we know this intrinsically, right? That they will fight against the data. Um, but as you say, Mike, if you can start to put stuff in front of them and you can take them on a journey of understanding the power of data, then I think you really can start to move the needles. And I know, Barbara, in your last role, you spent a lot of time putting structure around that and thinking around business plans and tracking business plans and getting data out of those things and using that, right, to justify the things that you wanted to get done.
Yeah, but to Mike's point, like I totally agree. I didn't do that much myself when I came into the firm for the first 6 months. It was all about observation. I was just
Mm.
observing what was currently going on in the firm and trying to understand people, process. I think that's key. I have been in another firm where I came in sort of like as a bull in a china shop, and that just doesn't work. It's like the need to or the need to show that you've got the knowledge and that you can do it, I think sort of like prevailed over, okay, let's take a step back. Let's try to understand the status quo. Let's see what's going on before actually making a move. And I think just like implementing technology, same with setting up systems, you need to understand people and process first before you can actually design the right system for the firm to be useful, because you don't just want to do it for the sake of having a system. I mean, I'm organized, but I'm not OCD. I love things to be in a nice manner, and that people can use it and find it. But it doesn't have to be overused. I think it's really good for that to take place after a period of observation, which also includes interviewing people, not only your own team, but partners across the firm. And don't forget the lawyers, associates, right? I think they give you a whole lot of information that is probably a little bit more relevant than your very senior partners who've been there already for a very long time.
I think you're right. You bringing in that observation, and then sort of the process, and then it's the finding the technology that maps to that sort of process. But I think law firms, it's like, oh, here, this is going to be this magic bullet, and
Exactly.
when everyone's going to align. It's no, no, no. You need to figure out how people align, get them to align, and then find. And I think that a lot of people do that backwards, and then they're trying to jam this peg in
Yeah.
this hole, and it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
They get
not going
frustrated that adoption is
to.
so low. And I'm like, yes, of course it is.
Yeah, you
That's
know,
such,
the,
it's such an interesting point, right? And we've seen that recently. And I have been involved with many firms that have deployed CRM, right? Big implementations and integrations and all of those sorts of things. And we've gone in and we've done training on the CRM system. if you press this button, it does this. If you press this button, it does this, right? And I think one of the things that's become very clear to me recently is that before you do technology, you have to you talk about common language, Mike. You have to have a common language, and you have to have, as much as you can, a common process around how business development works inside the law firm. Now, when you deploy technology, you can deploy it through the lens of, here are the things that we want you to do. Now, maybe you subscribe to Activator or, Mobunel or, one of these other principles, like pick one. Embed how you use the technology into those processes, right? Because my perspective, I've not dealt with a lot of lawyers, but I can imagine if the lawyer's sitting there, well, this is great, but I don't really know how this sits into my world. I mean,
Yeah.
can I build time on it? No. Can I search for case law on it? I'm being provocative intentionally, right? But yeah, how do we embed it into something, into structure that they have some context around?
I mean, to your point, I mean, literally have this conversation with people is so basically now people kind of see what relationships, yeah. So this is a great way you can kind of see how this might unlock opportunity. Yeah, but I'm the one who brings in all the business. I don't want people seeing that. And the fact that we've now rolled this thing out without asking these two people who's have the best relationships in the firm, they're not on board, and they're like, everyone else is just going to benefit from my. So basically, people are going to steal my clients now. It's like we haven't had these conversations, and now we're rolled out this, multi-thousand-dollar thing. Now you've got the number one person in the EC mad at you, and all you're trying to do is raise all ships. I mean, it's a process and a change management problem. The technology, you could have put the best technology in the world there, but you didn't get buy-in from Jenny, and Jenny's the one with the purse strings, and she's if she's not bought in, you could get all the rest of the people, but then she's gonna say something at the water cooler, and now, oh, Jenny's not doing it, this person, and that's where they fail.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that it comes back to that thing that we said at the beginning, which is, culture and North Star. Those people that you're talking about, they have to be aligned that there's a higher place that the firm is trying to get to, right? And if you can get them on board, if you can get the executive committee to agree that yes, we want to go in this direction, and to enable us to go in this direction, we have to change some things, and we all have to be on board with that. Then you can start to flow that down through the firm, right? But while you still have these big contributors who are just thinking about themselves, because historically, right, that's how they've had to think about the
That's how they're
world.
incentivized too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And they, of course, they're going to want to hold on to that unless you can show them that there's something bigger, something better that plays to the things that they care about, which is, as we all know, it's money, it's prestige, right? And how do we take them in that direction?
I'm shocked that it's someone started this, right? We've always done it this way, which Barbara, we said is the most dangerous thing,
Yeah.
but why aren't executive committees paid on a 3-year look back on the average of their last 3 years, right? Doesn't matter what you originated. Let's talk about the firm, and let's talk about, hey, if we want to increase more cross-selling, it's, hey, you know what, with things that start in your practice area, to the extent you grow them to 2 or 3 practice areas, you're going to get compensated on that. And, that's for you, that's for everyone on your team. Well, guess what? That Monday meeting, M&A meeting, just turned from instead of a bragging list where everyone's going in circles, they're saying, all right, how do we, collectively try to, increase this? What's working for you in fashion? How did you, oh, I brought in the labor person on this issue. Then you're getting those strategic conversations because you're telling people it's important instead of telling them it's important. And then, at the end of the day, they get comped from, going out and finding someone new when they're compensated more for finding someone new than they are for,
Yeah.
helping introduce their buddy. We're just going to be sitting here and, running in circles.
Totally. That's why we need to have systems in place, Mike, don't we? We need to
Yes,
have
we
good
do.
systems as a foundation for growth. I want to take the time to thank you very much for joining us on this podcast today. Time flies. We're already over 30 minutes, and I think we could keep talking for another hour for sure. But we would love to bring you back on. I know there is so much to talk about. This is a really interesting time currently for the legal industry. And I'm sure that we will speak again. We haven't really touched much on AI, and we'd love to get your thoughts on it too. That's obviously the theme and the buzzwords of this era. Thank you, Mike, for joining. Andrew, it's always a pleasure. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone in your firm who needs to hear it.
You can find us on Spotify and YouTube, and follow along on LinkedIn, where we keep the conversation going between episodes.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.